The entire imperial court held its breath the moment his shadow crossed the threshold. The emperor stood waiting on a dais of gold. Lord Tiānzǐ demanded a bow. The Iron Guard demanded a surrender. But the Mafia boss didn't even look at the throne. Instead, he walked past the center of the world, past the crown, past the centuries of lineage, past the pointed spears, and stopped in front of a black Sicilian maid with a silver tray. And that was the moment the empire began to crumble.
In a world where submission is the law and the emperor is God, one man recognized a higher power. Kwon Ji-Tae didn't collect titles, he collected debts. He didn't rule with a scepter, he ruled with a whisper and a blade. He moved through the shadows of Seoul like a phantom through a fortress. So when Lord Tiānzǐ summoned him to the palace for a public show of fealty, the world expected a clash of titans. It was supposed to be a ritual of dominance, a trial of ego, a final answer to who truly held the leash of the underworld. But no one expected Ji-Tae's answer to be a betrayal of the throne. Because the most dangerous message isn't delivered with a shout, it's found in the man who ignores an emperor to kneel before a ghost.
The obsidian-tinted windows of the limousine acted as a filter, turning the vibrant gold and vermilion of the imperial palace into the muted tones of a funeral procession. Kwon Ji-Tae sat in the back seat, his posture as rigid and unforgiving as the steel frame of the car. He didn't look like a guest invited to a summit. He looked like a storm front rolling toward a coast that didn't know it was about to be erased. His fingers, calloused from years of gripping cold metal and hot leads, traced the edge of an old frayed photograph tucked into his inner suit pocket, the only evidence that the ghost of Sicily wasn't just a legend. The car came to a halt at the base of the Great Dragon Stairs. A phalanx of the Emperor's Iron Guard stood in formation, their ceremonial armor clashing with the modern high-tech rifles slung over their shoulders. Ji-Tae stepped out, the humid air of the palace grounds clinging to his skin. He adjusted his cufflink, a small silver piece in the shape of a Mediterranean laurel, and took a breath. He wasn't here for the trade deal Tiānzǐ had proposed. He was here because his informants had finally confirmed that the woman who held the keys to the Mediterranean's shadow ports was working as a common servant in the heart of the emperor's private sanctuary. "Lord Tiānzǐ is expecting your absolute punctuality, Mr. Kwon," a young minister chirped, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the marble.
Ji-Tae didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge the man's existence. He walked past him, his polished shoes striking the stone with a rhythmic, lethal cadence that seemed to silence the surrounding birds. As he ascended the stairs, the architecture loomed over him, soaring eaves and golden gargoyles designed to make men feel small. But Ji-Tae felt nothing but a cold, clinical focus. He knew Tiānzǐ's game. The emperor enjoyed collecting broken things, fallen royals, exiled poets, and disgraced geniuses, keeping them in his palace like rare butterflies pinned to a board. He reached the summit of the stairs, and the massive gold-leafed doors swung open, revealing the great hall. The scent of incense was suffocating, a sweet, cloying mask for the rot of a dying empire. Ji-Tae's eyes didn't go to the throne at the far end of the room, nor did they linger on the ministers whispering in the alcoves. Instead, his gaze swept the perimeter, scanning the staff moving like shadows against the walls. Somewhere in this labyrinth of gold and ego, Serafina Moretti was holding a tray or polishing a floor. She was a woman who should have been ruling from a villa in Palermo, now reduced to a ghost in a gilded cage. Ji-Tae felt a flicker of something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite rage. It was recognition. He was a man who had built an empire out of blood, and he knew that a queen remained a queen even when she was forced to wear an apron.
"Welcome, King of the Underworld," the Emperor's voice boomed from the throne, echoing off the high rafters. Lord Tiānzǐ sat draped in silk, his crown catching the afternoon sun. "I trust the walk was enough to remind you whose ground you stand upon." Ji-Tae stopped 10 paces from the dais. He felt the weight of a dozen hidden snipers aiming at his heart, but he didn't blink. He didn't bow. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a pillar of black ink and tailored wool in a sea of unnecessary gold. "The ground is just dirt, Tiānzǐ," Ji-Tae said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made the ministers stop their whispering. "It's who stands on it that matters, and I believe you're hiding something that belongs to the world." The Emperor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "In this palace, everything belongs to me." Ji-Tae's eyes finally found what they were looking for. Near the left pillar, a woman in a classic black and white uniform stood with a silver tray. Her posture was too staid, her eyes too calm. She looked at him for a fraction of a second, a glitch in her performance of servitude, and Ji-Tae knew the hunt was over. The invitation hadn't been a summit, it had been a door, and he was about to kick it down. Serafina Moretti moved through the great hall with the practiced, liquid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to occupy space without ever being seen. To the ministers and the Iron Guard, she was merely a component of the palace's furniture, a pair of hands to pour tea, a bowed head to receive a complaint, a shadow that cleaned up the messes of the powerful. This was her greatest armor. In the decades since the red moon over Palermo had turned her world to ash, invisibility had been the only currency that kept her breathing. She could still smell the jasmine of Sicily if she closed her eyes, but it was always followed by the scent of gasoline and spent brass. She remembered the night the Moretti name was supposed to have ended. She remembered the heat of the fire as she crawled through the wine cellar's narrowest vent, a girl of 13 watching the light of her family's legacy go out in a roar of betrayal. She had fled across 3 continents, shedding her language, her pride, and her name, until she reached the only place where the Sicilian ghosts couldn't follow, the inner sanctum of Lord Tiānzǐ. In the Emperor's palace, she had perfected the art of the ghost maid. She kept her posture steady and her eyes downcast, but her mind was never at rest. While she polished the gold leafing of the pillars, she memorized the shift patterns of the guards. While she served the Emperor his midnight jasmine tea, she read the documents left carelessly open on his desk. She knew which floorboards in the East Wing creaked and which digital locks had a 4-second delay in their reset cycle. She wasn't just a servant. She was a cartographer of a golden cage, waiting for a day she feared would never come. The arrival of the Korean Mafia boss had sent a ripple of static through her carefully curated piece. As she stood by the left pillar, the silver tray felt heavier than usual in her hands. She had heard of Kwon Ji-Tae, the man who had risen from the gutters of Seoul to claim a throne of shadow. He was a creature of the new world, cold and clinical, whereas her family had been creatures of the old. She expected him to be like all the others, arrogant, loud, and blind to the woman standing 3 feet away from him. But as Ji-Tae stepped into the hall, Serafina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the palace's air conditioning. He didn't look like a man here to negotiate.
He looked like a man who had finally found the trail he had been hunting for years. When he stood before the emperor, he didn't bow, and for a heartbeat, Serafina saw a reflection of her own father in his defiance, a refusal to acknowledge a power that didn't earn its respect. Then the glitch happened. Ji-Tae's gaze swept the room, dismissive of the gold and the guards, until it locked onto her. It wasn't the wandering eye of a man looking for service. It was the laser focus of a predator recognizing its kin. Serafina felt her heart hammer against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that threatened to break her composure. She tightened her grip on the tray, her knuckles turning white against the silver. She had spent 10 years becoming a ghost, but under Ji-Tae's intense, fearless eyes, she felt the terrifying weight of becoming human again. He knew. Somehow, across the oceans and the years, the king of the underworld had seen through the apron and the bun to the Donna underneath. The silence of her life was about to end, and as she met his gaze for that split second, she realized that the massacre in Sicily hadn't been the end of her story. It had only been the prologue.
The great hall was a cathedral of manufactured silence, broken only by the rhythmic, metallic clinking of the emperor's rings as he tapped his fingers against the golden armrest of his throne. Lord Tiānzǐ sat elevated, a god in silk, looking down at the man in the black suit who dared to breathe his air without trembling. The iron guard shifted, their armor groaning like tectonic plates, their eyes fixed on the back of Kwon Ji-Tae's head. In the history of the palace, no man had ever stood this long without his forehead touching the floor. "The silence is growing heavy, Mr. Kwon," Tiānzǐ said, his voice dripping with a lethal, feigned patience. "Perhaps you've forgotten the weight of the crown you are standing before. A bow is not a request in this room. It is the price of your departure." Ji-Tae didn't flinch. He stood like a pillar of obsidian, his shadow stretching long across the polished marble. He could feel the laser sights of the hidden snipers dancing across his shoulder blades, but his focus was elsewhere. His gaze remained locked on the pillar to his left, where Serafina Moretti stood. She was a statue of servitude, but her eyes were screaming. She was watching the countdown to an execution, her silver tray trembling just a fraction of a millimeter, a minute vibration that only a man who lived on the edge of death would notice.
"I only bow to those I respect, Tiānzǐ," Ji-Tae finally spoke, his voice a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate the very incense smoke in the air. "And I don't respect a man who hides behind gold and stolen ghosts." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Ministers paled, and the captain of the guard stepped forward, his hand white-knuckled on the hilt of his ceremonial blade. The insult was a physical blow, a crack in the Imperial foundation. But the true scandal was only beginning. Instead of lowering his head, Ji-Tae did the unthinkable. He turned. He didn't turn to leave. He turned his back, fully and deliberately, on the Emperor of the East. To turn one's back on the throne was a declaration of war, an act of such profound insolence that it stopped the heart of every guard in the room. The air grew so thin it felt like it might spontaneously combust. Ji-Tae walked away from the dais, his footsteps sounding like hammer blows against the silence, heading straight toward the girl with the silver tray. "Mr. Kwon, halt!" the captain roared, the sound of drawing steel ringing out like a scream. Ji-Tae didn't stop. He ignored the spears leveled at his chest and the rifles clicking into fire mode. He stopped inches from Serafina. The contrast was a violent poetry, the immaculate tattooed predator and the quiet hidden queen. The ministers watched in horror, certain they were about to see a massacre. They expected him to strike her, or perhaps use her as a shield. They were wrong. Kwon Ji-Tae, a man who had never bent for a king, slowly sank to one knee. He bowed his head, not to the throne of gold, but to the woman in the black and white apron. "Donna Moretti," he whispered, the Sicilian dialect cutting through the stale palace air like a cold wind from the Mediterranean. "The mountains have been lonely without you. Your kingdom is waiting."
They were wrong. Kwon Ji-Tae, a man who had never bent for a king, slowly sank to one knee. He bowed his head, not to the throne of gold, but to the woman in the black and white apron. "Donna Moretti," he whispered, the Sicilian dialect cutting through the stale palace air like a cold wind from the Mediterranean. "The mountains have been lonely without you. Your kingdom is waiting." The tray in Serafina's hands clattered, and she finally let go of the mask. The sound of silver hitting marble was the starting gun for the chaos. Behind them, Lord Tiānzǐ rose from his throne, his face twisted into a mask of purple imperial rage. "Kill them!" the emperor hissed, his voice trembling with the weight of his wounded pride. "Kill them both!" In that moment, the order of the empire vanished. The guards lunged, the snipers tightened their fingers, and the great hall transformed from a room of state into a kill box. But as Ji-Tae looked up at Serafina, he saw the ghost vanish, replaced by the sharp, tactical fire of the girl who had survived Palermo. The bow that never came for the emperor had been given to the only person who mattered, and now the palace was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield. The silver tray clattered to the marble floor, the sharp ring of metal on stone sounding like a funeral bell for the silence Serafina had maintained for a decade. The world seemed to stall, the oxygen sucked out of the great hall as Kwon Ji-Tae, the most feared shadow sovereign of the East, remained on one knee. He was a man who moved mountains and broke kings, yet he stayed bowed before a girl in a stained apron, his forehead lowered in a gesture of absolute, terrifying fealty. "Donna Moretti," he repeated, his voice no longer a whisper, but a resonant declaration that echoed off the high, gilded rafters. "The blood of Sicily has been dormant, but it has never been thin. I have crossed oceans to find the true crown of the Mediterranean." Serafina's breath hitched, her lungs burning as if the fires of Palermo had finally caught up to her. The name, her real name, felt like a physical weight, a ghost she had tried to drown now rising to the surface with bared teeth. She looked down at the top of Ji-Tae's dark, meticulously styled head. In this light, the dragons coiling around his neck seemed to bow alongside him. By naming her, he hadn't just recognized her. He had stripped away her invisibility, tearing down the wall of glass she had built between herself and the world. The shock in the room was a palpable, vibrating force. The emperor, Lord Tiānzǐ, stood slowly from his throne, his face a mask of wounded pride and sudden, sharp calculation. His butterfly was no longer a common insect pinned to a board. She was a predator of a different lineage. Behind him, the Iron Guard leveled their spears, the sound of clicking safeties on high-caliber rifles creating a rhythmic, mechanical growl. "A Moretti?" Tiānzǐ hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and realization. "You brought a viper into my house and I let it serve me tea? You've been hiding the heir to the Sicilian ports under my very nose, Ji-Tae. This isn't a greeting, this is a declaration of war." Ji-Tae rose then, his movements slow and fluid, like a predator finishing a prayer. He didn't look at the emperor. His eyes remained fixed on Serafina, searching her face for the woman she used to be. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object.
He took her hand, her fingers trembling and cold, and pressed her a gold signet ring into her palm. It bore the crest of a phoenix rising from a bed of vines, the Moretti seal. "Your father gave this to my father before the fire," Ji-Tae said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register meant only for her. "He told him that one day the world would need a queen who knew what it was like to be a ghost. That day is today, Serafina." The exposure was complete. The ministers were scrambling, their whispers turning into frantic shouts as the political implications of a Moretti-Kwon alliance began to settle. Serafina felt the eyes of the guards, the snipers, and the emperor boring into her, no longer seeing a servant to be ignored, but a target to be eliminated. The peace of her invisibility was gone, replaced by the scorching heat of the spotlight. She looked at the ring, then at the man who had just destroyed her quiet life to save her soul. She realized then that Ji-Tae hadn't come to the palace to negotiate a treaty. He had come to ignite a revolution. "They will kill us for this," she whispered, her voice finally finding its strength, though it was jagged and raw. Ji-Tae's eyes flashed with a cold, terrifying light. He adjusted his suit jacket, his presence expanding until he seemed to fill the entire cavernous hall. "Let them try, Donna," he replied, a faint, dangerous smile touching his lips. "I've spent my whole life learning how to kill kings. Today, I'll teach you how to reclaim a throne." Behind them, the Emperor's voice roared over the chaos, a final command that broke the tension like a glass wall shattering. "Take them! Bring me their heads!" As the Iron Guard lunged forward, the Sicilian whisper ended, and the roar of the underworld began.
The air in the great hall didn't just grow cold, it solidified into a jagged, lethal edge. Lord Tiānzǐ's face, usually a mask of porcelain-smooth arrogance, contorted until the veins in his neck throbbed against his high silk collar. The wounded pride of an emperor was a volatile thing, and Ji-Tae had just set a match to it. "You dare?" Tiānzǐ's voice was a low, guttural vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. "You dare treat my home as a recruitment ground for your gutter wars? In this room, she is a servant. In this room, you are a corpse." He raised a single trembling hand and snapped his fingers. The sound was like a hammer cocking. The Iron Guard moved with mechanical, terrifying precision. The rhythmic stomp of their boots on the marble sounded like the drumbeat of an execution. From the shadows of the upper balconies, the glint of sniper lenses shifted, tracking the dragon tattoos on Ji-Tae's neck. The guests, ministers, and sycophants who had spent their lives polishing the emperor's ego scrambled toward the exits, their panicked whispers replaced by the sharp, metallic sliding of bolts. "Seize them!" the emperor roared, his voice cracking with the strain of his fury. "Bring the man to his knees and put the girl in chains. I want her to watch as I dismantle everything he has ever built." Ji-Tae didn't wait for the first spear to drop. He rose from his knee with the explosive grace of a coiled spring. In one fluid motion, he shed his suit jacket, revealing the shoulder holster beneath and the intricate dark ink that mapped his skin like a warning. He stepped in front of Serafina, his body a shield of tailored wool and lethal intent. "Donna," Ji-Tae said, his voice terrifyingly calm amidst the mounting storm. "The exit is 300 meters behind the Emperor's dais. Can you get us there?"
Serafina didn't hesitate. The ghost was gone, replaced by the tactical survivor who had mapped this palace in the dark. She reached into the folds of her apron and pulled out a small, heavy ceramic vase she had been preparing to fill with water. With a sharp, practiced motion, she smashed it against the marble pillar. "The floorboards in the third quadrant are hollow," she shouted over the clatter of advancing armor. "If we break the line there, the weight of their suits will slow them down."
The first wave of guards lunged. Ji-Tae met them with a brutality that was almost artistic. He moved through the formation not as a man, but as a force of nature, striking joints, snapping wrists, and using the momentum of their own heavy armor against them. The great hall, once a shrine to imperial dignity, transformed into a slaughterhouse of gold and blood. Ceremonial banners were torn from the walls, used as makeshift garrotes. Porcelain vases worth millions were reduced to shards beneath the boots of men who no longer cared for art. Lord Tiānzǐ watched from his throne, his eyes wide with a mix of horror and fascination. He had surrounded himself with statues for so long that he had forgotten what real fire looked like. He watched as the black Sicilian maid, the girl he thought he had broken, moved with the precision of a general, guiding the Mafia boss through the kill zones she had identified years ago. A gunshot echoed, shattering a massive chandelier that hung like a frozen sun above the center of the room. Thousands of crystal shards rained down, a glittering curtain of glass that reflected the carnage below. In the chaos, Ji-Tae grabbed Serafina's hand, his grip a silent promise of survival. "Now!" Serafina cried, pointing toward the heavy tapestry behind the throne. They weren't just running for their lives, they were tearing a hole in an empire. As they vaulted over the emperor's polished table, spilling ink and ancient scrolls, the battlefield of the ballroom became a blur of silver and red. The emperor's rage had started the fire, but as Ji-Tae and Serafina disappeared into the shadows of the palace's hidden veins, it was clear that the fire was no longer under his control. The throne was still there, but the room was no longer his. It belonged to the ghosts who had finally decided to fight back.
The heavy velvet tapestry swung shut behind them, muffling the chaotic roar of the ballroom into a dull, rhythmic thud. Suddenly, the air was different, colder, smelling of damp stone and the metallic tang of ancient machinery. They were no longer in the Emperor's world of gold and lies. They were in Serafina's world now. "Keep your head down," Serafina whispered, her voice losing its submissive tremor and sharpening into a tool of command. "The ceiling is low here, and the steam pipes reset every 60 seconds. If you touch the copper, you'll lose the skin on your hands." Ji-Tae followed her, his eyes adjusting to the dim amber glow of the emergency lights. He watched her move, marveled at how she navigated the narrow, claustrophobic crawl space with a fluid, haunting familiarity. She wasn't just running, she was hunting a path. She stepped over a tangle of wires with the grace of a dancer and pressed a hidden lever disguised as a rusted bolt. A section of the wall hissed open, revealing a narrow gallery that overlooked the Imperial Council chamber. "You've been here before," Ji-Tae noted, his hand resting on the grip of his weapon as he scanned the darkness. "I've been everywhere," she replied, her silhouette sharp against the faint light. "For 3 years, I wasn't just cleaning his floors, Ji-Tae. I was mapping his soul. I know where he keeps his records, I know which ministers are taking bribes from the triads, and I know exactly how many steps it takes to get from the throne to the armory without being seen by a single camera." She led him deeper into the palace's skeleton, through glitches in the architecture that shouldn't have existed. They moved through hollowed-out service ducts and behind the two-way mirrors of the Emperor's private study. At one point, she stopped, placing a hand on his chest to halt him. Through a narrow ventilation slit, Ji-Tae saw the Iron Guard rushing through the hallway below, their boots thundering like a landslide. They were looking for a maid and a businessman. They weren't looking for the ghosts in the walls.
"Why stay?" Ji-Tae asked, his voice a low vibration in the cramped space. "With this knowledge, you could have fled a dozen times." Serafina turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the amber light with a fierce, cold intensity. "In Sicily, we have a saying, the wolf doesn't leave the fold until the shepherd is dead.
Tiānzǐ didn't just hide me, Ji-Tae. He profited from the massacre of my people. He brokered the deal that put the fire to my father's house. I wasn't waiting for a chance to run. I was waiting for a catalyst. She reached out and touched a sequence of stones on the wall. A heavy iron door groaned open, revealing a spiral staircase that plunged into the bowels of the palace. This leads to the central server room and the old tunnels that predate the city. From there, we can reach the harbor. Ji-Tae looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. She wasn't a victim he had rescued. She was a weapon he had simply helped unsheath. The ghost hadn't been a victim of the Emperor. She had been a parasite, slowly draining the palace of its secrets while she waited for the right hand to strike the match. "You're not just a Donna," Ji-Tae murmured, a ghost of a smile touching his lips despite the sirens beginning to wail in the distance. "You're a revolution." "I'm a Moretti," she corrected him, her hand gripping the cold iron of the railing. "And it's time the Emperor learned that some ghosts don't just haunt, they burn the house down." She stepped onto the stairs, her black and white uniform vanishing into the shadows, and Ji-Tae followed her into the dark, realizing that while he had come to find a queen, he had found something far more dangerous, an equal.
The spiral staircase terminated in a room that hummed with a low electric thrum, the nerve center of the palace. Here, the air was filtered and cold, a stark contrast to the stagnant incense of the throne room above. Rows of server towers blinked with hypnotic blue and green lights, processing the secrets of a nation. Serafina didn't hesitate. She moved to a terminal at the far end of the room, her fingers flying across a haptic keyboard with a speed that spoke of 1,000 midnight rehearsals. "The Emperor thinks he's a god because he controls the narrative," Serafina whispered, her eyes reflected in the scrolling lines of code on the monitor. "But gods are made of myths. Empires are made of ledgers." Ji-Tae stood guard at the heavy iron door, his weapon drawn, his eyes scanning the security monitors she had bypassed. He watched her work, the way her shadow stretched across the glowing tech, and realized that her decade of silence hadn't just been about survival, it had been an excavation. "There," she said, her voice dropping to a jagged, hollow register. "The bloodline ledger." She pulled a file onto the main screen. It wasn't a list of names or territories. It was a series of wire transfers, offshore account numbers, and encrypted communiques dated 10 years ago. Ji-Tae stepped closer, his gaze hardening as he read the translated headers. The transfers originated from a private Imperial fund, routed through a dozen shell companies, and ended in the accounts of the very mercenaries who put Sicily to the torch. "He didn't just broker the deal, Ji-Tae," Serafina said, her voice trembling with a decade's worth of suppressed grief. "He funded it. He paid for the gasoline. He bought the bullets that took my brothers. He wanted the Moretti ports to be his private gateway into Europe, and my father wouldn't sell. So Tiānzǐ decided to clear the land." Ji-Tae felt a cold, familiar rage settling into his bones. He had seen the depths of human greed before, but the clinical, bureaucratic nature of this massacre was a new kind of evil. The Emperor hadn't just killed a family, he had balanced a checkbook with their lives. "He thought a 13-year-old girl wouldn't understand the numbers," Serafina continued, her hand hovering over a drive as she began the final download. "He thought if he hid me in his kitchen, I'd be too grateful for the scraps to look at the books. He forgot that a Moretti is taught to read a ledger before they learn to read a prayer."
She yanked the drive from the console just as a red light began to strobe across the ceiling. An alarm, high-pitched and keening, tore through the digital silence. The servers began to lock down, their cooling fans spinning into a frantic roar. "He knows we're here," Ji-Tae said, his jaw tightening. He looked at the drive in her hand, the physical manifestation of a dead family's justice. That data isn't just proof, Serafina. It's a death warrant for his entire dynasty. If that gets to the global syndicates, he won't just lose his palace, he'll lose his head. Serafina tucked the drive into the hidden pocket of her apron, the same place she had kept the stolen signet ring. The transition was complete. She was no longer the girl who served tea. She was the woman who held the emperor's execution order. "Good," she said, her eyes burning with a dark Sicilian fire. "I don't want him to just lose. I want him to watch the world find out that the great emperor is nothing but a common thief with a crown." Ji-Tae kicked open the door to the maintenance tunnel, his silhouette framed against the red emergency lights. "Then we need to move. The harbor is 4 miles through the old drainage pipes. If we don't make it to my ship, this data dies with us." Serafina stepped into the dark beside him, the hum of the servers fading behind them. They were no longer running from a crime. They were carrying the evidence of one. The emperor had spent 10 years thinking he had silenced the Moretti bloodline, but as they plunged into the belly of the city, the silence was finally over. The ledger was open, and the debt was about to be collected in blood. The maintenance tunnel spat them out into the sprawling expanse of the Imperial Gardens, a labyrinth of ancient cypress trees and white stone bridges that glittered under the artificial moonlight of the palace spotlights. The air was no longer silent. The rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors and the distant baying of hounds signaled that the emperor's fury had officially breached the palace walls. "Through the weeping willow grove," Serafina urged, her voice tight with the adrenaline of a hunted queen. "The bridge at the end of the lotus pond leads directly to the outer perimeter wall. It's the only way to the harbor." They moved like twin shadows, Ji-Tae's heavy boots crunching on the ornamental gravel, while Serafina navigated the terrain with a ghost-like familiarity. Behind them, the first wave of the Iron Guard emerged from the palace terrace, their tactical flashlights cutting through the mist like white blades. "They're gaining," Ji-Tae noted, his breathing deep and controlled. He stopped for a fraction of a second, firing a precise volley from his weapon to suppress the lead pursuers, the muzzle flashes illuminating the intricate tattoos on his hands. "Keep moving, Serafina. Don't look back." The stone bridge ahead was a narrow bottleneck, an elegant arc of carved marble that felt like a trap. As they reached the center of the span, the world exploded in a shower of sparks and stone chips. A sniper, positioned high in the east pagoda, had found their range. Serafina stumbled as a bullet grazed the marble railing inches from her hip. Before she could regain her balance, the air was ripped apart by the sharp whip crack of a high-caliber rifle. It was a kill shot, aimed precisely at the center of her back, timed for the moment she was most exposed on the crest of the bridge. "Ji-Tae!" Serafina cried, reaching out to catch him, her eyes wide with the horror that mirrored the night in Palermo. "Go!" he hissed through gritted teeth, his face a mask of cold, agonizing determination. He shoved her toward the far end of the bridge, his good arm steadying his weapon to return fire. "I told you, I've spent my life learning how to kill kings. A scratch from a coward's dog won't stop me." The sacrifice was a physical weight between them. In the underworld Ji-Tae came from, loyalty was often a transaction, a debt to be paid in coin. But as he stood there on the bridge, bleeding for a woman the world saw as a maid, he was proving a different truth. He wasn't just her sword, he was her shield. Serafina grabbed his arm, pulling him with a strength born of desperation. She didn't leave him. She couldn't. Together they dove into the thick foliage on the other side of the pond, just as a second volley of bullets chewed into the stone where they had stood. The bridge of fire was behind them, but the scent of blood was now part of the trail. "You took it from me,"
she whispered as they huddled in the shadows, her hands trembling as she tried to stem the flow of blood from his shoulder. Ji-Tae looked at her, his eyes reflecting the flickering fires of the palace security flares. "My life was empty, Donna," he murmured, his voice strained but steady. "I think I was just waiting for a reason to bleed for something real." Above them, the sirens wailed, but as Serafina helped the wounded Mafia boss toward the final gate, the power dynamic had shifted once more. He had given her his blood. Now she would give him her empire.
The harbor air was thick with the scent of salt and diesel, a stark, honest contrast to the suffocating incense of the palace. Kwon Ji-Tae leaned heavily against the railing of his private cruiser, his shoulder bandaged and his face pale, but his eyes were burning with a cold, triumphant light. Behind them, the Imperial Palace was no longer a symbol of untouchable divinity. It was a hornet's nest of panic. Serafina stood at the center of the deck, the wind whipping her black and white maid's uniform, which was now torn and stained with the dirt of the tunnels and the blood of a king's protector. In her hand she held the drive, the blood-lined ledger that had already begun its digital transit across the globe. By the time the sun rose, every major syndicate, from the triads to the cartels, would see the proof of Tiānzǐ's treachery. The emperor's fall wouldn't come from a coup of swords, but from the sudden withdrawal of the world's trust. He had stolen from the very men who kept him in power, and the underworld did not forgive a thief. Ji-Tae stepped toward her, his movements slow but steady. He reached out and placed the Moretti signet ring back into her palm, his fingers closing around hers. "The message has been sent, Donna," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that carried over the churning wake of the ship. "The Emperor is a ghost. The only question left is who will fill the vacuum he leaves behind." Serafina looked out at the receding skyline of the city, her gaze fixed on the flickering lights of the palace. For 10 years she had been a shadow, a silent witness to the greed of men who thought they were gods. She had learned their secrets, mapped their weaknesses, and waited for the moment when the ghost of Sicily could finally stop running. "I am not going back to Sicily to hide, Ji-Tae," she said, her voice clear and resonant, stripped of every trace of the servant she had pretended to be. "The Moretti name was built on the ports of the Mediterranean, but the world has grown smaller since then. If the order is changing, then I want the seat at the head of the table."
Ji-Tae bowed his head, not out of obligation, but out of a deep, marrow-deep respect. He had spent his life as a king without a cause, a warrior who ruled a kingdom of ice. In Serafina, he had found the fire. "I told you I was a man who knew how to kill kings," he murmured, looking up at her with a dangerous, loyal smile. "But a queen needs more than a killer. She needs a sword that never dulls." "And you?" she asked, her eyes searching his. "The East will be in chaos when Tiānzǐ falls. Will you return to Seoul?" "Seoul is just a city," Ji-Tae replied, stepping into her space, the dragons on his neck dark against the moonlight. "I would rather be the hand that guards the new empress of the underworld. Let them call us the glitches in their system. Let them fear the day a Mafia boss and a Maid decided to rewrite the laws of power." As the ship surged into the open sea, the transformation was complete. The invisible girl was gone, replaced by a woman whose name would soon be whispered in every boardroom and back alley from New York to Palermo. Behind them, an empire was burning. Ahead of them, a new kingdom was being born. Serafina Moretti slid the signet ring onto her finger, the gold cold against her skin. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was the architect of a new world order, and with the deadliest man in the East standing as her shadow, the world would finally learn that the most dangerous person in the room is the one you never bother to look at.
Watch out for more. Hit the subscribe button to see me next.